In a laboratory corner lighted for observation, a spider anchors a single thread and releases itself into empty space. The silk does not snap, even though its diameter is thinner than a wavelength of visible light. No muscle contracts to spin it. No gland pulses with visible rhythm. The spider simply allows gravity to take over, trusting a material that should not exist at this scale. How does a creature this small rely on forces that seem misaligned with physics? In forests, fields, and city balconies, spiders occupy nearly every terrestrial environment on Earth except the coldest extremes. They have done so for hundreds of millions of years, with no wings, no jaws designed for chewing, and no centralized sensory organ comparable to eyes or ears. Their bodies are compact, hydraulic, and exposed to failure at every joint. By conventional biological logic, such a design should be fragile. Yet spiders persist where many lineages vanished, raising an uncomfortable question. Recent studies in biomechanics, neurobiology, and materials science have not simplified the spider. They have complicated it. Measurements of silk strength rival industrial polymers. Behavioral experiments reveal choices that appear context-dependent. Sensory responses register vibrations far below what most animals can detect. Each new dataset clarifies one detail while eroding another assumption, leaving a growing gap between explanation and observation. Why do these systems work at all? Spiders are often dismissed as simple predators with a single evolutionary trick. But when examined closely, nearly every aspect of their biology violates expectations formed by other animals. Their survival depends on mechanisms that should be inefficient, unreliable, or impossible at their size. This is not a story of fear or fascination, but of unresolved contradictions. And once those contradictions are seen clearly, the question changes from what spiders are doing to why any of it works. The first assumption is that spiders are just insects with extra legs, a convenient mental shortcut that collapses under the smallest amount of scrutiny. Spiders are not insects, not in structure, not in development, and not in how their bodies manage energy. Insects rely on rigid exoskeleton leverage, while spiders depend on internal fluid pressure to extend their limbs. This alone changes how force, damage, and motion are distributed. Why would evolution favor such a fragile-seeming system? Another assumption is that spiders succeed because they are efficient hunters, but efficiency implies optimization toward a clear goal. Spiders often wait motionless for days, expending energy without guaranteed return. Their metabolic rate is low, but not negligible, and their prey capture success varies widely by environment. Many spiders survive long periods without food, not because they are efficient, but because they tolerate metabolic uncertainty. That is not the same thing as optimization. It is also assumed that spider silk exists simply to catch prey, yet spiders produce multiple silk types, each with different chemical and mechanical properties. Some silk is sticky, some is dry, some is elastic, and some is stiff. Producing silk is metabolically expensive relative to body mass, yet spiders discard and rebuild webs repeatedly. If energy conservation were the rule, this behavior would make little sense. So what pressure justified such cost? Spiders are often thought to be visually guided predators, but many species see poorly or not at all. Their eyes lack resolution compared to insects like dragonflies, and yet they navigate complex environments with precision. This suggests that vision is not the primary organizing sense, which contradicts how most mobile predators operate. If not vision, then what structure is carrying the informational burden? Each of these assumptions fails for a different reason, but the failure points in the same direction. Spiders are not built around speed, strength, or sensory dominance. They are built around constraints that seem to limit them, not empower them. To understand why those limits persist, the investigation has to move far back, to a time before modern ecological rules fully formed. The spider lineage separated from other arthropods long before flowering plants reshaped terrestrial ecosystems. Fossil evidence places early arachnid ancestors over 400 million years ago, when land surfaces were sparse, unstable, and chemically hostile. Oxygen levels fluctuated, soil structure was inconsistent, and predation strategies were still experimental. Spiders did not emerge into a refined system, but into an environment without reliable patterns. What survives under those conditions follows different rules. Unlike insects, spiders never developed wings, despite existing alongside winged lineages for hundreds of millions of years. Wings offer escape, dispersal, and access to new niches, yet spiders remained bound to surfaces. This was not a failure to innovate, but a commitment to a different solution set. Their evolutionary path rejected aerial dominance in favor of tension, anchoring, and weighting. Why that choice persisted remains unclear. The spider body plan stabilized early and changed relatively little compared to other arthropods. While insects diversified into millions of forms, spiders retained a narrow structural template. That stability suggests strong constraints rather than creative freedom. When change occurs slowly across geological time, it often means deviation carries high risk. What kind of system punishes modification so severely? Fossilized silk structures, rare but documented, suggest that early spiders already used thread-like materials. This places silk not as a late adaptation, but as a foundational trait. If silk came first, then many later features may exist to serve it, not the other way around. That reverses the usual logic of trait development. Modern evolutionary frameworks expect adaptive radiation to produce variety, yet spiders demonstrate persistence without radical diversification. They survived mass extinctions that erased dominant predators and reshaped food webs. Survival without expansion suggests that spiders were not competing by speed or size, but by fitting into ecological gaps others could not use. The question becomes, what constraint locked them into this narrow, enduring form? Spiders operate at a size scale where surface forces dominate over inertia. At this scale, air behaves less like empty space and more like a viscous medium. A falling spider does not fall the way a mammal would. Drag, filament tension, and electrostatic forces exert measurable influence. This changes what movement even means, forcing spiders to solve problems that larger animals never encounter. Survival here requires different physics. Their hydraulic limb system illustrates this constraint clearly. Spiders extend their legs not by muscle contraction, but by pumping hemolymph into the joints. This limits speed and precision, but allows lighter limb construction. The trade-off is instability under injury or dehydration. In dry conditions, hydraulic pressure drops and movement becomes impaired. Why adopt a system so vulnerable to environmental variation? Respiration presents another limit. Spiders use book lungs or tracheal systems that restrict oxygen flow compared to vertebrate lungs. High-energy lifestyles would overwhelm this system quickly. This makes sustained pursuit hunting impractical for most species. Instead, spiders rely on bursts, ambush, or waiting strategies that minimize oxygen demand. Energy conservation is not a choice, but a requirement. Temperature also exerts strict control. As ectotherms, spiders cannot regulate internal heat. Their enzymatic processes slow dramatically in cold conditions. In warm environments, metabolic rates increase, but dehydration risk rises. These opposing pressures narrow the window of optimal activity. Any successful adaptation must function within these limits. Even growth is constrained. Spiders must molt to grow, rendering them temporarily immobile and vulnerable. Each molt carries a non-trivial risk of death. Large body size would amplify this risk, which helps explain why spiders remain relatively small despite the advantages size can bring. Constraints shape not only behavior, but boundaries. Taken together, these pressures form a narrow corridor of possibility. Within it, spiders survive not by overcoming limits, but by aligning with them. Their solutions look strange because they are not solutions to familiar problems. They are responses to a world governed by different forces, and those responses demanded mechanisms that appear improbable from the outside. Spider silk is often described as strong, but strength alone does not explain why it works. At the molecular level, silk combines stiffness and elasticity in proportions that materials science struggles to replicate. The proteins self-assemble under ambient temperatures, without high pressure or toxic byproducts. For a system operating inside a small abdomen, this defies expectations. How such precision emerges without centralized control remains unresolved. Silk production also violates assumptions about mechanical reliability. The spinnerets that extrude silk lack rigid alignment structures. Threads are drawn out through motion and tension rather than forced through a fixed mold. Minor variations in movement or humidity should produce inconsistent fibers, yet measurements show remarkable uniformity. The system appears tolerant of noise in a way engineered processes are not. Adhesion presents another contradiction. Capture silk must be sticky enough to hold fast-moving prey, yet not adhere permanently to the spider itself. This balance depends on microscopic droplets whose chemistry shifts with humidity and temperature. Laboratory analysis shows these droplets reorganize when stretched, maintaining contact under stress. The mechanism works, but not for reasons that are fully understood. Even silk recycling challenges intuition. Spiders consume their old webs, breaking the silk down internally and reusing the amino acids. This process should degrade material quality over time, yet regenerated silk retains functional properties. The system behaves more like a closed-loop manufacturing process than a biological secretion. Where the error correction occurs is still unknown. Silk also transmits information. Vibrations travel along threads with minimal loss, allowing spiders to detect prey, mates, and environmental disturbances. This dual role as structure and sensor is unusual. Most animals separate these functions into distinct organs. Spiders collapse them into one medium, raising questions about how signals are interpreted. This improbable material did more than enable trapping. It expanded the spider's interaction with space itself, allowing them to sense, move, and even travel through air in ways that bypass traditional locomotion. Once silk existed, it opened doors to sensory extensions that no limb or eye could provide. A spider does not primarily experience the world through sight or sound, but through tension. Vibrations moving through silk arrive faster and with more directional clarity than airborne signals at this scale. A disturbance a few micrometers wide can register as meaningful information. This shifts perception from image-based awareness to pattern-based detection. The environment becomes a field of forces rather than objects. Experiments show that spiders can distinguish between prey struggling, wind interference, and courtship signals using vibration alone. The signals overlap in frequency, yet spiders respond differently depending on context. This suggests interpretation rather than reflex. The known mechanism involves mechanoreceptors in the legs, but how these signals integrate into decision-making remains unclear. Where does interpretation occur? Spiders also detect airflow changes with fine sensory hairs, responding to movements too subtle for human instruments to register reliably. These hairs bend under minute pressure differences, converting motion into neural input. At the spider's scale, air behaves more like a textured surface than empty space. This reframes navigation entirely, replacing vision with distributed sensation. Unlike centralized sensory organs, these receptors are spread across the body. Legs, pedipalps, and even the abdomen contribute input. Damage to one area does not fully blind the spider to its surroundings. This redundancy suggests perception without a dominant channel. The brain receives fragments rather than a single stream. Behavioral studies indicate spiders can adjust responses based on prior exposure. Habituation to non-threatening vibrations has been documented. This implies some form of memory, yet spider brains are small and structurally simple. The gap between neural capacity and behavioral flexibility is difficult to reconcile. How much processing can occur without centralization? If perception is distributed, then cognition may be as well. Rather than a single decision center, spiders may operate through local evaluations linked by silk and body sensors. This challenges familiar models of awareness. It also reframes later behaviors that appear planned, but may arise from something more diffuse. When a spider hunts, it does not always react immediately to prey contact. Some species wait, testing tension patterns before committing. Others release additional threads to alter the web's response, effectively changing the environment before acting. These behaviors occur within seconds, under conditions where hesitation should reduce success. Yet the delay appears intentional. What information is being evaluated in that pause? Navigation adds another complication. Spiders displaced from their webs can return using indirect routes, even when visual landmarks are altered. Experiments suggest reliance on path integration and vibrational cues rather than memorized images. This form of navigation operates under uncertainty, where error accumulates rapidly. That spiders succeed suggests a compensatory mechanism that has not been fully described. Courtship behavior further complicates interpretation. Male spiders produce species-specific vibration patterns to avoid being mistaken for prey. Females respond differently based on timing, frequency, and repetition. These exchanges resemble negotiation more than reflex. The cost of error is death, yet the system tolerates variation. How such fine discrimination evolves without a large neural investment is unclear. Some spiders modify web structure in response to repeated prey failure. Thread spacing, tension, and placement change over time. This is not instantaneous reflex, but gradual adjustment. The spider appears to test outcomes and alter construction accordingly. Whether this represents learning or simple feedback remains debated. Even escape behavior resists simplification. When threatened, spiders may drop, freeze, or retreat depending on context. The same stimulus does not always produce the same response. This variability is difficult to model with fixed action patterns alone. It suggests evaluation of risk relative to position and energy state. These behaviors do not require labeling as intelligence to be unsettling. They demonstrate flexible responses emerging from limited anatomy. If spiders can evaluate, delay, and adjust actions without centralized cognition, then the boundary between mechanism and decision becomes unclear. That uncertainty shifts the question once again. In modern environments, spiders are no longer confined to forests and fields. They inhabit buildings, bridges, streetlights, and underground infrastructure. Urban heat islands alter their activity cycles, while artificial lighting reshapes prey availability. Some species now build webs where insects concentrate unnaturally, exploiting conditions that did not exist a century ago. Adaptation here is not slow or theoretical, it is observable. Field studies show shifts in web architecture near human structures. Threads become thicker where vibration noise is high, and placement changes to avoid constant disturbance. These modifications occur without genetic change, suggesting behavioral plasticity rather than evolution in the strict sense. Yet over generations, such plasticity can influence survival and reproduction. Where that leads remains open. Pollution introduces new constraints. Heavy metals and airborne particles accumulate on silk, altering its mechanical properties. Some spiders abandon contaminated webs more quickly, while others continue using compromised structures. The long-term physiological cost of this exposure is poorly understood. What appears as tolerance may mask delayed consequences. Climate change adds another variable. Rising temperatures expand the habitable range for some species while shrinking it for others. Changes in humidity directly affect silk performance and hydration balance. Spiders now encounter conditions that push their physiological limits more frequently. These pressures test systems that evolved under narrower environmental ranges. Spiders are not relics of a finished experiment. They are active participants in a changing world, adjusting within constraints that have defined them for hundreds of millions of years. Whether these adjustments represent resilience or approaching failure is not yet clear. What is certain is that the experiment is still running. Spiders challenge the expectation that biological systems should be intuitive. Their bodies operate at the edge of physical limits, using mechanisms that appear unstable, inefficient, or incomplete when viewed through familiar models. Yet those same mechanisms have persisted across mass extinctions and planetary change. The contradiction remains unresolved, not because of mystery, but because of scale and constraint. Each attempt to explain spiders in isolation misses how tightly their traits are coupled. Silk cannot be separated from perception. Perception cannot be separated from environment. Behavior cannot be separated from physical limits. Pulling one thread collapses the picture rather than clarifying it. Understanding requires accepting that these systems were never meant to resemble others. Modern science continues to narrow uncertainties, but it has not unified them. Data accumulates faster than synthesis. Spiders remain biologically ordinary in classification, yet conceptually disruptive in function. They force questions about how much organization is possible without centralized control, and how survival can emerge from constraint rather than dominance. Nothing about spiders needs to be exaggerated to remain unsettling. Their existence quietly resists explanation, even as it unfolds in plain sight. As research progresses, the question is no longer whether spiders make sense, but whether our frameworks are flexible enough to accommodate what they reveal.